Welcome, and thank you for tuning into this morning's panel as part of the Word on the Street Toronto 2021 Festival, our 32nd annual and second fully virtual. I'm Maya, your host, and we're very excited to be presenting In Conversation with Shayda Kafai and Amanda Leduc, an exploration of disability justice and activism in partnership with Diaspora Dialogues. Before we dive into our discussion, we need to recognize the land we occupy. The Toronto of today exists because of the Toronto Purchase, also known as Treaty 13, signed with the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation in 1805, with a final claim settlement in 2010. Watts Toronto also recognizes the history of the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, the Huron-Wendat, and the Seneca nations in this territory. The place in which Watts operates is the subject of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement to care for and share the resources around the Great Lakes in peace. Toronto, or Toronto, is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples with long histories on this land, and acknowledging this is only the first step in building a practice of land stewardship and Indigenous solidarity that honors these peoples. We encourage you to educate yourself about the land you occupy wherever you're tuning in from. And just a few announcements before we introduce today's panelists. Don't forget to sign up for our upcoming panels. This is the final day of our 10-day festival celebrating storytelling, ideas, and imagination. Later today, we will be joined by Irfan Ali, Jody Chan, and Chichia Yang for our panel celebrating the 2021 Trillium Book Award for Poetry. Following that, we will be celebrating the First Nation Communities Read Indigenous Literature Award. All information about our upcoming panels can be found on our website, toronto.thewordonthestreet.ca. If you want to be the first to know about new videos from the Word on the Street, please subscribe to our YouTube channel, where you can find all the panels from this year's festival. And if you enjoyed today's talk, please give this video a like to help others find it as well. And I'm very pleased to welcome our moderator for this panel, Dev Ramsawak. Dev is a disabled and non-binary multidisciplinary storyteller. They produce the podcasts Crip Representation and Sick Sad World, and edit the podcasts Leaders of Color and Possibilities podcast. They are also a writer, filmmaker, poet, and facilitator. Their fiction has been published in Two Times Removed, an anthology of Indo-Caribbean fiction, Toronto 2033, and Heart House Review. They also facilitate workshops independently and with a collective called Crip about topics such as ableism, disability justice, media, storytelling, content creation, and more. Welcome, Dev. It's so good to have you here this morning.
It's so great to be here, and I'm so excited to be talking with our panelists today.
Absolutely. We're excited to hear. So I'll pass things over to you.
Awesome. So first, I will start off by introducing one of our panelists. Amanda Leduc is the author of the novel The Centaur's Wife and the nonfiction book Disfigured on fairy tales, disability, and making space, which was shortlisted for both the 2020 Governor General's Award in Nonfiction and the 2020 Barbellion Prize. She is also the author of an earlier novel, The Miracles of Ordinary Men. She has cerebral palsy and lives in Hamilton, Ontario, where she serves as the communications coordinator for the Festival of Literary Diversity, or FOLD, and Canada's first festival for diverse authors and stories. So welcome, Amanda.
It's great to be here.
And next we have Shayda. Oh, wow. Shayda Kafai. Shayda Kafai is an assistant professor of gender and sexuality studies in the Ethnic and Women's Studies Department at California State Polytechnic University, Pomona. As a queer, disabled, mad femme of color, she commits to practicing the many ways we can reclaim our body minds from systems of oppression to support this work as an educator scholar. Shayda applies disability justice and collective care practices in the spaces she cultivates. Shayda's writing and speaking presentations focus on intersectional body politics, particularly on how bodies are constructed and how they hold the capacity for rebellion. In honor of self-care and her communities, Shayda is also an art maker and co-founder of Crip Femme Crafts with her wife, Amy. Thank you for joining us this morning.
Thanks for having me. I'm super excited to be here.
But before we start, how are you both doing? How are you?
You know, as okay as one can be during these oh, I hate the phrase, but unprecedented times. You know. Everyone understands when you say that.
Yeah.
How are you, Deb?
Oh, I'm fantastic. I'm just like really pumped to be talking with you both. Both of your books I got to read, and I'm just so pumped. Just to mention again, Amanda's book, The Centaur's Rife, and Shayda's book, Crip Kinship. And in fact, Shayda, would you actually like to read a little bit of an excerpt for us to lay the groundwork for today?
Sure. Can I give a brief, just like image description for folks?
Yeah, that would be great. And if we should do those as well,
Yeah, that would be
you can
amazing.
give us the example.
Oh my God, that would be amazing. Okay, so hello, y'all. I am checking in with you all from the unceded lands of the Tongva Gabrielino people, and I am an olive-skinned femme with short black hair with long bangs to one side. I have pinkish lipstick. I'm wearing a shirt that has bright red flowers and leaves on it, and in my background is like lots of plant babies and pictures on the wall and a big lamp. And yeah, I'm just super excited to be here.
Amanda, would you like to go next?
Yes. I am a white disabled woman. I wear black rimmed glasses. I have long brown hair that's curly and it's over to one side. I'm wearing a white a white turtleneck sweater sort of shirt. And I walk with a limp. So you can't see it when I'm stationary and sitting down, but when I move in that very particular way. And behind me is one plant baby and a copy of my book, The Centaur's Wife, as well as a picture on the wall of Amsterdam and one of its canals.
Yeah. I'm Deb. I use they, them pronouns. I am a light to medium brown skin person. I identify as non-binary, so I try to present kind of androgynously. I have a shaved head, 2 nose piercings. I'm wearing a black sweatshirt that says I'm not a boy or a girl, I'm dead, with the little skeleton guy doing finger guns. And my background, you can see the top of my purple couch, which is a very important feature of my life, and my picture wall, which has a bunch of framed posters and things like that in the background. Thank you, Shayda, for reminding me of that. And yeah, if you wouldn't mind reading us a little bit of Crip Kinship.
Sure. So this is an excerpt from the introduction, and it begins with an epigraph from Access-Centered Movement. You are not too sick, too disabled, too sad, too crazy, too ugly, too fat, or too weird. We live in a white supremacist, patriarchal, ableist culture that values oppressive standards for the sake of centralizing power and making profit. Our ostracism is a result of this system that demonizes difference and not a reflection of your worth, value, ability to be loved, etc. You are not the problem. You are perfect. This book is a love letter, an abundant offering written out of need. Need communicates, says disabled communities have wisdom, says we survive true when we declare and co-create a world that honors us, a world where we are never too much. Need says persistence, says Crip magic, says now. I lean into this exploration of need for all of us, but especially for the disabled, Crip, chronically ill, mad community who are also queer, gender nonconforming or transgender, also people of color, also the incarcerated many, the immigrant many, all of us also. I have written this book because my own disabled, mad, queer femme of color body mind needs to remember that ours is a legacy of resistance and revolution. Even as we live in a systemic, oppressive network of ableism, saneism, autism, racism, cis heteropatriarchy, and capitalism, we gather and manifest liberatory practices. We always have. Our disabled, queer of color body minds confront erasure and alienation. We actively revise the reductive narrative that we are inherently too damaged or too broken, that we are undeserving of celebration, joy, and beauty. For those of us that might have been told otherwise, or who might have never had access to our own Crip queer stories, Sins Invalid exists as a tether rooting us back to ourselves. Since their creation in 2006, the San Francisco Bay Area-based performance project provides the community disability justice-informed evenings of multidisciplinary art, workshops, and educational trainings that center the knowledges of disabled, queer, gender nonconforming, and transgender artist activists of color. Crip Kinship, the disability justice and art activism of Sins Invalid, explores their work and demonstrates how all our body minds, communities, and movements can benefit from Sins Invalid's resilient, disabled, queer of color future making. Last paragraph. Dear reader, Sins Invalid's dream work and art activism is not just for the disabled, queer of color many. It is for all of us, for all spaces and peoples in need of nourishment and thriving in our current contemporary. The performance project reveals that art made by an intersectional disability justice community holds power. It holds the potential to motivate us to question what we have been taught about our body minds, about who we have been taught is perpetually disempowered, and about who does and does not have voice. This is what Crip Kinship offers: a mapping of intersecting Crip networks, of thriving structures of Crip love gathered and shared. This is a book of collective witnessing, a gridwork of fibers, a persistent and complex arrangement of all things tender and kindred. It is an opening into a defiant persistent, a welcoming into a place liberated.
That was so lovely. Thank you for reading that. I just need to take a moment to. I know I already read it, but it's so powerful every time. First off, I wanted to, Shayda, you used the term body mind throughout Crip Kinship, and in the notes you define it as a term of unification, suggesting that our bodies and minds never engage in isolation from one another. Can you tell us a little bit more about this and where it comes from? Just because you do use it so often, and just wanted to understand just that part of the foundational part of it.
Yeah, that's a really great question. I think it's important to acknowledge that the first time I learned about bodies and minds, they were very much separate. And I learned about them in philosophy. And in that context, like the mind is privileged, and the body is very much not privileged and valued in the same way. And so when I started to see this appear in disability studies texts, I'm thinking of performance studies works, and I'm thinking of folks like Petra Kuppers who talk about embodiment and in-mindment as like a way of acknowledging that, hey, our bodies and our minds speak to one another and they engage in community. And then in acknowledging disability studies, I think it's important to even pull it back further and communicate that this concept is actually very much a part of Indigenous communities and communities of color. And so I want to name that because I think often disability studies as it was existing before and mainstream disability rights movement spaces were pretty much centering or were white centric. And so, this concept has older roots, Indigenous roots.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. And I think, you talk about that history within Crip Kinship a lot. And I'm really excited to get into that a little bit more. But first, Amanda, fairy tales are a key component of the Centaur's Wife being woven throughout the narrative in your book Disfigured, which came out last year, is also about disability in fairy tales. So while I was reading The Centaur's Wife, I was kind of wondering, like, which came first? Were you doing research for The Centaur's Wife when you started doing the writing for Disfigured, or was it the other way around?
So it was the other way around. I started working on The Centaur's Wife in 2016, and it didn't initially. It wasn't so much a book about disability as it turned out to be, but it sort of transformed into that about 2 years in, and I got to a point in 2018 where I was really struggling with it. I just wasn't, something wasn't clicking. And so I went on a writing retreat in on Hedgebrook on Whidbey Island off the coast of Seattle, and I was there and I was walking through the forest and thinking about the forest and how it's such a magical place, but then also how I have to be really careful when walking through a forest because I will trip at like the without a moment's hesitation. You know, if there's a tree root sticking out that I don't see, I'll go flat on my face. And I was thinking from there about how forests as such tend to be very inaccessible places, but the magical forests that we think about in sort of fairy tale culture and that sort of thing actually has included a lot of disabled people, in the sense that villains who are often coded as disabled in some sort of way are very much a part of fairy tale culture. And I was really interested by that connection. So I took a break from writing The Centaur's Wife and did some research on that connection between fairy tales and disability and started writing Disfigured. And so I had Disfigured finished actually about 6 months into the future. So in the summer, or maybe a year, in the summer of 2019, Disfigured finished. And by the time it was done, I sort of knew what I needed to do to fix the novel. So it was a really interesting exercise for me, and how sometimes books only come to you when they're ready. Like you need to become a certain kind of person, or you need to understand certain things in your own life before a book can come to be. So hopefully it's something that I can carry through to other projects, I think, and not just be impatient with them all the time.
That is something I am kind of just learning about myself, to be honest. I am always trying to jump ahead and jump into projects, and now it's sort of like, why don't I start with the building blocks? Maybe I need more research. So back to Shayda, and I also want to acknowledge a little bit how important Sins Invalid has been to my own disability justice practice and my own journey. They were the first sort of Crip activists of color that came onto my radar. I'm very fortunate for folks to introduce me to them. And was very excited to see an entire book dedicated to them and their teaching. So Shayda, that's really excited to see that. Your book also begins with the dedication to our disabled, queer, of color doulas and ancestors. I was really curious about your use of the word doula here and what you meant by it.
Yeah, and I just have to say too, like, I had a very similar experience, and I think a lot of folks do, of just like affirmation and recognition, either watching their shows and their programming at home or going to an event. So that language, I talk about it more later in the book. That's from our amazing disability justice ancestor, Stacey Milburn, in an interview with Stacey, Leah Lakshmi, Piepsna Samara Sinha on Alice Wong's podcast, Disability Visibility. They were having a conversation of the role of femmes of color, especially disabled femmes of color, in spaces and movement organizing. And Stacey offered that term of Crip doulas as a way to describe the people, the disabled people in our lives that move us toward an understanding of disability, not as something, negative, but as something that might be associated with pride, and distancing it from ableism or whatever system of oppression that you're working through. Because we have a lot of clear messages of what disability means from like a very ableist perspective, but we need to also name the people that kind of steward us into these places of empowerment and recognition. And so Stacey offered that term, Crip doulas, as a way to speak to and honor and really acknowledge the work, the really like loving, tender, communal work that goes into that practice.
That's really beautiful. Thank you for sharing that. That's such a heartwarming kind of concept to be thinking about. So for the both of you, and we were talking about ableism a little bit. So for our audience, for those who may be unfamiliar with the term ableism, ableism describes acts and beliefs from anywhere from an individual level all the way up to a societal level that perpetuate discrimination and oppression onto disabled people. In Crip Kinship, Patty Byrne says that ableism is becoming more and more entrenched with every generation. Do either of you feel like that's true? Are your experiences sort of reflecting that?
Can you just clarify, just entrenched in
each generation? That ableism is like more and more pervasive as the generations continue on.
Yeah. I would agree with that. I think there's a very pervasive link as well between ableism and wellness culture, which wellness culture, has always been a thing. And I feel like it's particularly become a thing during the pandemic. And sometimes people, are proponents of wellness culture with the best of intentions, because they're actually trying to take care of their minds and their bodies. But there's this very insidious sort of sense of ultimately with wellness culture, what you want is a body and a mind that looks and works a very particular kind of way. And I think we need to be really careful of that. And that, leads into fat shaming and that the sort of anti-fat culture that we find ourselves in, which has as its core this idea that, again, bodies only look a certain way, and it doesn't matter how you feel. If your body doesn't look a certain way, then you need to strive for a different ideal. And it is so insidious and pervasive because people link it with health, right? And think that, if you look a certain way, then you cannot possibly be healthy. And there's just a lack of nuance in all of that just seems to be getting further stripped away the farther along we go. Does that ring true for either of you?
Yes. Yeah. As you were speaking, I was just nodding my head and seeing resonances of that. And also, I'm thinking a lot about how language plays a role in this too. So I'm thinking about just like very casual uses of things like words like, and just, content notes, super ableist language right now. But words like, crazy, bipolar, lame, stupid, blind, dead, right? Like, I think the casual use of language also plays such a huge role in this. It's very subtle. It's kind of like a micro manifestation that has really large impact and effect. And so, I don't think we're also talking about language and just kind of having, looking, and I mean, I'm so glad that you brought up wellness culture, right? Because I think these are all things that maybe are so normalized and rendered common sense that we just kind of don't talk about them enough. And they absolutely, yes, perpetuate ableism.
Mhm. I think if I could too, Shayda, I love that you bring up language as well, because I think it's such a, they're all absolutely intertwined. And I think sometimes when we look at combating these issues, there's kind of almost an either or approach where it's like focusing on the language itself leaves aside structural issues for many people. And I always feel like it's not an either or, it's a both and, right? It's, you need to focus on the language and push for that structural change. And you push for structural change and then also focus on the microcosm of the language and the way that people think and speak. I mean, we can do this, right? We can focus on all of these things at the same time. With that care at the center of it, I think is key. Recognizing that, you know, we're not, no one is trying to impose a better way of living on anybody. It's that we're trying to care for one another and trying to encourage people to care for their fellow humans in all the ways that people need. And these are the kinds of conversations that I wish we would have when we talked about wellness culture.
Yeah, those are some fantastic points you're bringing, like you're both bringing up. And I don't think like, or I think that language and structural change are very heavily intertwined, because I think, you know, something that I've learned a lot when I was studying anthropology was that language does play such a major part in how we actually create our own realities and understand the world around us. So language is a major part of how we understand the world. And so if we change our language, we change our understanding of the world. I think that's really important to talk about. Amanda, you have, I wanted to take a moment to maybe get you to read a little bit from The Centaur's Wife, because it is such a fantastic book with some great disability representation, and I'd love to share some of that.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Deb. So I'll just read a little bit from the beginning of The Centaur's Wife. And for those who are unfamiliar with the book, it's a dystopia, and it takes place in a world where the world has been decimated by a meteor shower, and there are a group of survivors who kind of come together and build a community and try and figure out how they're going to survive, how they're going to build the new world together. And one of the main characters is named Heather, and she has cerebral palsy, much like myself. So this is just a little bit of a beginning section with her, talking about her, some of the forces that shaped her when she was a child. She'd been a strange child, dark-haired and quiet, her limp sometimes imperceptible and other times visible from halfway down the street. She had a crutch when she was tiny, but then when she was a little older, only her own unsteady feet. Her mother worried about shoes and braces. Her father said it didn't matter. "No one else walks like you, Heather Feather," he would say to her. "That is something to be proud of." When she was a baby, her family had moved from their house under the mountain's shadow to a house in the city proper, at the end of the last street before the mountain fields, a house that backed out onto thick forest. "We've moved for her. We need to be close to good schools," her mother always said, though Heather knew it was for her mother too. The mountain made her mother nervous in a way she couldn't explain. So instead, she focused on the things that she could know, how far away the schools were, how long it would take Heather to walk there. "I don't want her to have to walk too far," her mother said. "I don't want her to get tired." "Heather's a trooper," her father said. She'd been born 2 months early. They hadn't been sure she'd survive. "The more she walks, the stronger she'll get." "I know that," her mother said. "But what will the children at school think?" The children at school thought she walked funny and told her so. They imitated her when they thought she wasn't looking, the uneven circle of her hips, the slow swing of her right leg. They laughed. School became another place for her to practice being alone. The stories she told herself on the playground were like the stories her father told her at night before bed. The stepsisters who cut off their toes so they could wear the glass slipper, or Hansel and Gretel with no happy ending. "The witch has a crutch," she said to her father, "like the one I used to have." "But you don't need the crutch anymore," he told her, and the witch was only pretending. Then he told her about the mermaid who drowned herself in the sea. "Stop telling her those stories," her mother would say. Her mother, who had fallen in love with a dark-haired boy who worked outside and sang to trees. They were older now, with bills and a house and a child. No more romantic nights beneath the stars for them. Most days she felt foolish when she remembered who they used to be. In the city, it was easier for Heather's mother to pretend that Heather's father was merely eccentric. He might go for long walks at night. He might go closer to the mountain than anyone was supposed to go. His whole family had been like that. Dreamers, people who told you a good story but forgot to put food on the table. In the city, this could all be kept secret. That was the point of being city dwellers now, not outcasts who lived in a strange house under the mountain. He could tend the municipal gardens. She could teach at the school. "Stop telling her things that are sad," Heather's mother would say. "She gets enough of this already." But Heather wasn't sad, not really. The world was deep and dark and wonderful. Sometimes, like when she was at school, she did not like to be in it, and sometimes she did cry. But that was okay. Her father made it okay. I'll just stop there.
What I really loved about reading The Centaur's Wife was there were a lot of parts where you're describing Heather's, experiences with her family around acknowledging her disability and, being seen as someone who needs to be super cared for, but also someone who needs to be told like, oh, but you can do anything. Really was something that resonated with me and was like, oh, this reminds me of growing up a little too much. But it was so refreshing to read a character and actually feel like my experience was represented in some way. Oh, sorry. Did you want to add something?
No.
Okay. In The Centaur's Wife, you specifically named that Heather has cerebral palsy, but there were a few characters that I would venture to say were coded as having some more like invisible disabilities. Was that on purpose? Do you think there's some value in having characters with possibly undiagnosed disabilities?
Absolutely. I mean, yes, you're right. Heather has cerebral palsy in the book, and then there's a character with cystic fibrosis. There's characters who are dealing with various levels of trauma and PTSD. There's a character who arguably is dealing with some elements of narcissistic personality disorder and things like that. And it was really, it really is important to me to show that in an ideal world, if everything was perfect, we would recognize that people just occupy the space that they occupy in the world, and they are entitled to everything they need to live their lives. And we wouldn't, in that perfect world, necessarily need to say, I have cerebral palsy, and therefore I need this, this, and this. It's just, this is me, this is how I walk, this is what I need. I also have major depression, and this is also what I need for this. And I think part of the way that I think we get toward a world like that is through storytelling and through normalizing the fact that, in fact, a lot of people have or, operate in the world in some way with what we would consider disabilities. I wear glasses. Glasses are hugely normalized in culture, right? And yet most of the people who wear glasses wouldn't necessarily think of themselves as having a disability because they have an assistive device that mitigates the impact of their disability. So they can go through the world. They operate on an equal footing in many respects because they, this disability is taken care of for them. And so for me, it's important to write stories that feature characters who have a wide range of disabilities so that people just see it as normal. People talk about how disabled characters aren't featured a lot in fiction, and that's true. That sort of overt I am a disabled character isn't always a function of the fiction that we read, but there are characters who have glasses, there are characters who have anxiety, there are characters who deal with things like mental illness or depression. There are characters who deal with postpartum depression all the time. And it's just not necessarily named as a disability because there's a certain stigma still attached to that naming. And I want to, you know, hopefully do my part to move toward a world where there is no more stigma attached to that. And we instead operate in a world where, you know, no one's going to get shunned if you say that you have these needs. People are just going to say, okay, here, we can give you those needs. No problem at all. Like, it's not going to be an issue. And obviously, we have a long way to go before we get there. But it's kind of like what we were talking about earlier with the links between language and structural change. I think there's a huge link between the way that we tell stories and the way that we view the world. And I hope that I can continue to do my part to you know, move change along in that particular arena.
Yeah, I think there's a link there to always naming disabilities and the medical model as well, and always having to identify a disability in order to accommodate it. And sometimes we don't even need to have that justification needed. We can just be like, what do you need as a person? And if that's related to your body or your mind in whatever way, that's cool. That's just what you need. I think that's really awesome. A really great point. So I'm going to draw from another quote from Crip Kinship. So you quote Alice Wong, who wrote, "There's power in storytelling. Before I can tell you a story, you need to really love and praise yourself. You need to say that I do have a story, that I do matter." And this is for both of you. Do either of you feel like in creating your works, it was an act of loving yourself?
Whew. When I read that question, I was like, okay, this is a phenomenal question that I think applies to anybody who embarks on this thing we're calling writing, right? Especially for disabled folks. And so, because I think in and of itself, writing brings up so much like self-doubt and inner criticism. I completely resonated, Amanda, when you were talking about how like we have to be patient for the book to just come into being. We can't rush it. So yeah, this was very much a love project and taught me how to move slowly in Crip time, which is just like moving slowly, acknowledging that on some days when I had the intention to write, and if I woke up with a lot of brain fog or anxiety or depression, those were not going to be writing days. And how do I navigate that in a loving way? Just understanding that I have to listen to my body mind as I embark on the process. And I also ended up creating, y'all can't see it, but it's to the, well, my left, your right of my computer. But I ended up creating this writing altar with little frames of all my Crip queer doulas of color, just to like remember that this is something that's being written in community. So on the days when I felt most isolated in the process, it was just a reminder. But yeah, I had to learn how to take breaks. I had to learn how to listen more closely, especially when writing heavier chapters. But this was most certainly a practice in self-love and embracing all my disabled, mad needs as I wrote.
Yeah, absolutely. I would echo all of that. Thank you for putting it so well, Shayda. I think for me, it was my original intention with writing Disfigured was in part because at that point, by the time the idea for Disfigured came around, I had sort of an inkling that The Centaur's Wife was going to be about disability, but I wasn't quite sure how it was going to come out. And so I wrote Disfigured, and the original intention was just to have it as kind of a a little bit of a marketing tool in many ways for the novel when it came out, because it expanded on the themes. And what it ended up being was almost kind of like a self-manifesto in some ways. And it was really amazing because it was, I've been writing toward disability my whole life, and I hadn't really realized it. Goodness, I hadn't really realized it, and I had left that little girl far behind, and it went. Sorry.
Oh, don't apologize, please.
Whew. I had left that little girl far behind me because I had so many bad memories of what it meant to be a disabled child and to be made fun of in school. And it wasn't until I returned to her that I recognized the power in acknowledging what that kind of life does to shape somebody, and the kind of insight that it gives, and the way that you can see people in a way that I don't think I would have been able to see had I not occupied this body. So in that sense, both of these books were a huge expression of love. And I'm very grateful to both of them because they changed who I was. The act of writing these books changed who I was as a writer. It changed who I was as a person. And I will always be grateful for that.
Thank you for sharing that. And I just want to say both of your books felt like loving pieces of work to me. I do think you can feel the love in The Centaur's Wife, and it was that your experience of being a disabled child that really does resonate with me, and it was just very lovely that to have a space in the literary world that just acknowledge those hard, difficult feelings and the complexities that exist there, and just how we carry those complexities with us in a lot of different ways. And yeah, reading The Centaur's Wife, it really did. It would like have those moments where it's like you unlocked a memory, and I'd be like, oh right, that was something that would happen in school, kind of a thing. And just having something acknowledge that and be like, you didn't make this up in your head, like this is an experience that happens. It's very important. So thank you both for writing your books. And yeah, I just wanted to acknowledge that. I do want to take a moment to remind our audience that we are also taking questions. So if you have questions, to drop them in the chat, and Maya will get those to me. And otherwise, I will be continuing on with my questions, because I do have so many questions for the both of you. So Amanda, I'm going to jump back to you for a moment and, go back to fairy tales for a second. And happy endings, happily ever after is, something we associate with fairy tales a lot. And I was wondering, considering the times that we are living in at this moment, do you think it's, an important time to be focusing on creating happily ever afters in this time?
I think So one of the things that's really powerful for me about fairy tales is that they can have both of those things, right? You have fairy tales that have happy endings, and then you have fairy tales that don't end happily at all, or have, endings that we maybe wouldn't consider a traditional happy ending. And I think it's important to have both of those things. I think when I think about writing, I think about books. It's important to have books that are escapism, but then books that also operate as mirrors to the world in which we live, and show some of the world in which we live. And so for me, it was important in writing The Centaur's Wife that, there is hope at the end of the book, but it doesn't necessarily end, in a way where you think of when you think of a traditional happy ending, with all of the things happily resolved and all the storylines tied off and that sort of thing. And it was important to me to do that because I think real life doesn't always end the myriad stories that we have within our individual story lives don't always have happy endings, or things do not always work out the way that we want them to work out. And there needs to be, for me, a certain kind of acceptance and grace, and a moment of just recognizing that the writer Cheryl Strayed talked about it as, sometimes things will work out and sometimes things don't work out. And acceptance is a small, quiet room. And it really is. And I think, again, going back to the, discussion about having things normalized in story, I think we do ourselves a disservice if all we're doing is looking at stories that end happily all the time. If all we're doing is looking to create stories that have happy endings. I think there's just as much power, and honestly just as much hope in writing stories that don't have happy outcomes, but that still continue in some way. Because, on some level, the disabled life is what many people would see of as a not happy ending. And yet I am here writing stories to say, Shayda is here writing stories to say that, we are disabled, and yet we are quite capable of having happy, fulfilling lives. Even despite these things, the chronic pain and other difficulties and whatnot that some people would look at and say, oh, well, I would rather not have those things in my life, thanks. Like, well, guess what? Humans are made of wonderful, amazing things and capable of so much, and we can pull, happy lives from anything.
Yeah, and I mean, I feel like that's such an important part of disability justice too, that we embrace messiness and really kind of distance ourselves from this myth of perfectionism. There's generative excitement in mess. That's our realities. That's okay.
Yeah, I really like that troubling of what is a happy ending, and is your unhappily ever after just the start of my story. That's a really key point to make. Thank you so much for bringing that up. Shayda, so both in Crip Kinship and just in the work of Sins Invalid in general, both of you are focusing on erotics and intimacy, drawing on works from like pleasure activism from Adrienne Maree Brown, which is currently on my coffee table. Why center that when talking about disability? And when you're doing that, how do you leave room for disabled people who might identify on the asexual or ace spectrum?
Oh, yeah. I think that's such an important question, especially because earlier disability studies, like texts, were using the word asexuality to talk about the lack of sexuality when writing about disabled folks. And now it's shifted to desexualized. But I think it's super important to acknowledge sexuality and eroticism and beauty for disabled folks in particular, because I think we're coming out of a lineage of things like ugly laws and freak shows and, forced sterilizations, disabled folks have occupied a lot of spaces where our bodies are desexualized, living in public space in boarding cares, being institutionalized. And so the idea of saying that, disabled folks have beauty, deserve sexuality is a political act.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not my idea. That's coming from Sins Invalid and from disability justice work. That just as important as other things like access needs, if one wants to be sexual and thinking about access around sexuality, that's critical. It's another vocabulary that our body minds need access to if we desire it. And then I think if we're talking about sexuality as being political, it's choice. It has everything to do with choice, which I think opens up space for all types of folks, including asexual folks. And one of the, I think, gifts of disability justice, and this is coming from one of the small interviews that Sins Invalid does on their Facebook channel called Crip Bits, intimacy and eroticism, that doesn't have to be tied to sex. I think in like our normative world, sex is a very specific thing, but if we crip sex, and if we render sex disabled, it could be all sorts of things. It could be platonic cuddles. It could be gardening and eating a tomato. Like eroticism and intimacy can mean so many things. And so that's one way that I think through disability justice, through the cripping of sex, that we can hold space for all folks, whether you are asexual or you identify in another way.
That's so true, and it's so incredible. And as you're speaking, it actually made me make this connection of how important it is that in The Centaur's Wife, you begin with not just a disabled main character, but a disabled woman, a disabled mother who's just had children, the result of, sex and specifically, I don't want to get into too many details because I want folks to read it for themselves. But, the way in which Heather conceives the child and her relationship with the father of the child, I think it's so amazing that you have brought in, sexuality into this disabled story in a way that wasn't a focus or a key component, but underlines it. And, I'm sort of wondering, like, was that on your mind when you were writing it, or was that just something that kind of happened?
Mm-hmm. Well, I had, when I was early in the stages of writing the book, I had this image of Heather walking, limping through the forest with her twins. So she has these twins strapped to her chest, and it's just this kind of, it's a dystopia. Everything around them has kind of crumbled. And I just had this image of her doggedly trying to go along and take care of her children, which operates as a kind of metaphor for, in some ways, for postpartum depression and the way that, as a new parent, your whole life is just kind of thrown to the winds, and you have to think about how to redo it, or not redo it, but how to rebuild. But I was interested in The Centaur's Wife because there's a real point of tension in some ways between Heather and her husband, where she has a lot of internalized ableism as well, where, she doesn't see herself as desirable, or she worries about not seeing herself as desirable. So she doesn't really, on some level, she really struggles with believing that her husband can find her desirable. And, that's something that she has to work through in the book. And I guess, my fascination with non-happy endings, I couldn't make it simple for her. I couldn't just, have her fall in love and have that be that. She does have a love interest in the novel who's not her husband. And there's a particular kind of relationship that they have, and a particular kind of point of connection that actually hinges more on the fact that both she and her love interest occupy different bodies, right? They have different ways of moving through the world, and there's that kind of connection that feels more strongly for Heather in some ways. But I also, if I may, I also just want to give a shout out to Leanne, who is listening to this this session right now. Leanne is a writer, a wonderful writer who lives here in Canada in Kitchener-Waterloo, and Leanne has twin boys. And I met Leanne several years ago at a event that I did, and I was writing The Centaur's Wife at the time. And I thought about Leanne a lot when I was writing and thinking about Heather and her twins. And yeah, from one CP friend to another, like, here's a fist bump for you, Leanne, across the screen. Thank you for inspiring me in that way. And I think it just, that's another really magical thing for me that just shows how much we draw from each other in community, and how much we reach across, screens and miles and all these kinds of things to find one another and get strength from one another. So just wanted to mention that.
And thank you for doing so. And we only have a couple minutes left, so I'm going to try and sneak one quick question in. And I guess this is technically for you, Amanda, but in Crip Kinship, Shayda talks about the importance of telling stories, of acknowledging these Crip lineages, of learning. And you've already mentioned a couple of folks who've been important on your journey, but I was wondering if, in Crip Kinship, Shayda talks a lot about a lot of American activists, which makes sense, Sins Invalid being from the Bay Area. But I was wondering if maybe there were any activists more local to you or to here in Canada that you wanted to mention that were important to your journey here.
Absolutely. I do, but I wondered if, Shayda, if you could mention some of those activists, because I know some of the people that are watching today may not have as much familiarity with the U.S. disability activism lens. So if you could give some of the names of people who've inspired you, please share.
Ooh, yes. So, and I guess I can type this in the chat too, just for spelling, but I immediately think of Patty Byrne and Leroy F. Moore Jr., who were part of the original co-founding team for Sins Invalid. I think of Stacey Milburn, Alice Wong, Nomi Lamb, Leah Lakshmi, Piyapsna Samarasinha, and then like other folks that were part of my doula community, Vanessa Durand, Lilac Maldonado. So those are just a few folks that were very important to me personally.
Thank you for that. For me, yeah, there's definitely been people. Dorothy Ellen Palmer, who is a Canadian writer, who has written a wonderful memoir called Falling for Myself, as well as a number of other wonderful books. She has been instrumental in my own disability journey, and I owe her so much. And then other Canadian writers like Adam Podle and Hamilton. Just these people have been so instrumental in helping me understand how important it is that we get our disabled stories out into the world. Leah Lakshmi as well has been such a pivotal figure, and also not so much in Canada, but the work of writers and activists like Imani Barber and Kia Brown and Rebecca Coakley in the States. I learned from them so much. And I really would encourage everyone who's listening today, if you aren't already, to follow these people on Twitter, follow them on Instagram. Imani has a TikTok channel. And frankly, you don't need to watch anybody else on TikTok. You can just watch Imani and she will fill up your whole day. And I really, in these times of isolation and whatnot. I'm really grateful to the ways that the internet has allowed us to continue having community and continue showing us different community as well. So I really encourage everyone to seek out those names. I will also try and put them in the comments. Can I? Has the comment been closed?
I think these are, we only have access to the private.
I see. Okay.
But thank you so much, both of you, for sharing your thoughts with me today. This was such an amazing conversation, and I hope that we can continue to have these conversations offline or somewhere else online, because I wish I could ask more questions, but that's all we have time for. And yeah, David says you can type them in and they'll add them to the YouTube description.
I will do that. Thank you both for sharing space here today. It's been such an honor, and I'm so grateful.
Yeah, Dev, thank you for just being such a lovely moderator and asking such loving questions. And Amanda, I'm so excited to read The Centaur's Wife, and I'm so glad that we were in conversation.
Same.
Yes, thank you all. I just have to echo that. And also, we didn't have any questions in the YouTube chat today, but our viewers are there expressing their admiration and gratitude, and I'm here to echo that as well. Thank you all for your insightful, vulnerable, and thoughtful conversation this morning. It's been a joy to listen and learn from you all, and to thank you for your generosity. And thank you. And thank you to everyone tuning in from home. You can find Crip Kinship by Shayda Kafai or The Centaur's Wife by Amanda Leduc at our virtual bookstore in partnership with Another Story Bookshop and Baka Phoenix Books, or at our official ebook and audiobook seller, Rakuten Kobo. Today is the final day to sign up for our giveaway in partnership with Rakuten Kobo. Visit toronto.thewordonthestreet.ca/2021-festival-contest for your chance to win one of 3 special prizes, including a new Kobo e-reader. Remember, for each day of the festival you tune in, we'll announce one bonus entry code. Today's bonus entry code is Spectacular. Make sure to tune in later today to our panel celebrating the 2021 Trillium Book Award for Poetry. That's happening at 11:30 a.m. with Irfan Ali, Jody Chan, and Chuchia Yang. Then this afternoon, we will be presenting the First Nation Communities Read Indigenous Literature Award at 1 p.m. For more information about this year's lineup, as well as the panelists you've heard today, visit our website, toronto.thewordonthestreet.ca. If you'd like to support The Word on the Street by making a donation, simply head to our website and click Donate Now at the top of our homepage. Thanks again for joining us, and have a great day.